A cowboy lived by himself for 10 years, until a wet bride fell down at his front door. Malachi Thorne had promised himself he would never trust women, love, or anything that came with caring about another person. But when he opened his door that stormy night, everything he built to protect his heart was about to break in one moment. The thunder was as loud as guns going off across the valley as Malachi walked onto his porch. He heard what sounded like crying mixed with the howling wind. There, lying against his wooden steps like a broken toy, was a woman in a wedding dress so wet it stuck to her like a second skin. White silk that looked gray from mud and rain, with torn lace dragging behind her like broken dreams. He stood there frozen, coffee cup still warm in his old hands, watching this stranger who came from nowhere on the worst night in weeks. She wasn't moving. For a second, he thought she might be dead. Just another problem. The world had dropped on his doorstep to test how much kindness he had left. 10 years. 10 years he'd lived without anyone stepping foot on his land. And now this, a bride of all things. Life had a weird sense of humor. Malachi put down his cup and got down on his knees beside her. Rainwater quickly soaked through his old jeans. Up close, he could see she was breathing. Short, hard breaths that made little clouds in the cold air. Her dark hair was stuck to her face, but he could see pretty features marked by being tired and something that looked like fear. Even while unconscious, he'd seen that look before on his own face in the mirror. The morning he found his wife with another man. "Ma'am," his voice came out rougher than he wanted, rusty from not talking much. No answer. She was completely out, and the storm was getting worse. Lightning lit up the mountains in the distance, showing walls of rain moving toward them like an army coming to fight. Malachi looked back at his cabin. Warm, dry, safe. Everything he'd built to keep the world out. Then he looked down at this mysterious woman who'd somehow found her way to the one place that was supposed to stay hidden from heartbreak and problems. He could leave her there, walk back inside, finish his coffee, pretend he never saw her. By morning, she'd either be gone or dead. And either way, his peace would stay the same. But when another bolt of lightning split the sky, he saw something that made his stomach hurt. On her left wrist, barely visible under the mud and torn lace, were bruises, dark marks shaped like fingers that told a story he knew too well from his time as sheriff. Back when he still believed in protecting people, someone had hurt her, and she'd run so far, so desperately, that she'd ended up here at the edge of nowhere in a wedding, dressed that now looked more like clothes for a funeral. Malachi said a bad word under his breath and picked her up, surprised by how light she felt even though she was soaked. As he carried her toward his door, her head rolled against his shoulder, and he got a look at her face in the porch light. She was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that had once made him believe in forever, and that scared him more than any storm ever could. He kicked open his door and walked inside. Water dripping from both of them onto the wooden floor he'd carefully kept clean in his loneliness. As he laid her on his couch, the same couch where he'd spent many nights convincing himself he was better off alone, she moved a little, her eyes open for just a moment, green eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been relief. She tried to speak, lips moving without sound before she went unconscious again. But in that quick moment, Malachi saw something that made his chest tighten with a feeling he'd spent 10 years trying to forget. Hope. And he knew that. Whatever brought this woman to his door in a ruined wedding dress wasn't just going to change her life. It was about to break down the walls around his heart and make him remember what it felt like to care about someone other than himself. The question was whether he was strong enough to survive it this time. When she woke up 3 hours later, the first thing Evangeline saw was a pair of steel gray eyes watching her from across the room. The second thing she noticed was that she was no longer wearing her wedding dress. Panic shot through her like lightning. She sat up fast on the strange couch, holding a rough wool blanket to her chest, her heart beating hard against her ribs. The room spun a little wooden walls, a stone fireplace crackling with warmth, the smell of coffee and something that might have been soup. "Easy." The man's voice was calm, steady, He sat in a chair by the window, hands folded loosely in front of him, not trying to come closer. "You're safe." Safe? The word felt strange in her mouth. She hadn't been safe in months, maybe years. Her eyes looked around the room, searching for exits, for weapons, for any sign of the men who'd been chasing her through the storm. Where? Where am I? Her voice came out as barely a whisper, throat sore from crying and screaming into the wind. "My ranch, middle of nowhere, which I'm guessing is exactly where you were trying to get to." He tilted his head slightly, stunning. Her face. "Name's Malachi Thorne. Been living out here alone for about 10 years now." Alone? That explained the careful distance he was keeping. The way he seemed almost uncomfortable having another person in his space. But it also meant no one knew she was here. No one could find her. "Your dress was soaked through. Figured you'd rather not freeze to death while unconscious." He pointed toward the fireplace where her wedding gown hung from a makeshift line, steam still rising from the fabric. "There's dry clothes on the table there. Used to belong to someone else." The pause told her everything she needed to know about that someone else. Thank you. She meant it. This stranger had saved her life, given her clothes, given her shelter without asking questions. But experience had taught her that kindness always came with a price. "What do you want?" Something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe hurt. Nothing. Storm's still going out there. When it passes, you can go wherever you were headed. It was then that Evangeline realized she had nowhere to go. The storm might pass, but the men hunting her wouldn't stop. Her brother's gambling debts didn't disappear just because she'd run from the altar. Clayton Voss didn't forgive, and he certainly didn't forget when someone made him look foolish in front of half the territory. "I can't leave." The words fell out before she could stop them. "They'll find me. They'll drag me back." And this time, she touched her wrist without thinking, feeling the bruises Clayton had given her when she tried to refuse the marriage. Malachi's face got dark. "Who's looking for you? People you don't want to cross. Trust me." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "I should go. I don't want to bring trouble to your door. Trouble's already at my door. Question is whether I'm going to let it freeze to death on my porch or do something about it." He stood up, moving to the window to look out at the storm. Lightning showed his profile. Strong jaw, weathered skin, the kind of face that had seen too much and learned to expect nothing good from the world. "Besides," he said without turning around, "I haven't had a good reason to use my rifle in years. Might be nice to remember what it feels like to fight for something worth protecting." The way he said it made Evangeline's chest tighten with something she hadn't felt in so long. She'd almost forgotten what to call it. But even as hope began to grow in her heart, the sound of horse hooves thundered in the distance, barely heard over the storm. But getting closer, they'd found her. Malachi heard them too. His body went stiff at the window, every muscle tight like a spring ready to snap. After 10 years of quiet, he could tell the difference between thunder and trouble. And that rhythmic pounding cutting through the storm was definitely trouble. How many? His voice had changed, taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. Evangeline closed her eyes, listening to the approaching hoofbeats with the practiced ear of someone who'd been running for her life. 4, maybe 5 riders. Clayton doesn't travel light when he's hunting. Clayton. The name came out like a curse. Clayton Voss. Her blood turned to ice. "You know him?" Malachi turned from the window, and the look on his face made her stomach drop. Every lawman from here to San Francisco knows Clayton Voss. Question is, what does a man who owns half the silver mines in Nevada want with a woman in a wedding dress? "I was supposed to marry him today." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "My brother owes him money, a lot of money. I was the payment." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling fire and the growing thunder of horses getting closer. Malachi stood perfectly still, thinking about what she'd told him, and Evangeline could practically see him weighing his choices. Help a stranger and make an enemy of one of the most dangerous men in the territory, or hand her over and go back to his peaceful loneliness. She wouldn't blame him for choosing peace. She'd learned long ago not to expect heroism from men when it might cost them something. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen," he said finally. hidden door under a rug. You can wait there until... No. Evangeline stood up, holding the blanket around her like armor. I won't hide while you face them alone. If they find me here, they'll kill you just for giving me shelter. I won't have your blood on my hands, and I won't have yours on mine. He moved to a cabinet near the fireplace, pulling out a rifle that looked well kept despite years of not being used. Get to the cellar. That's not a request. The hoofbeats were close enough now that they could hear individual horses, voices calling out commands. Evangeline recognized Clayton's voice among them, calm, controlled, deadly patient. He'd found her trail and followed it here to this safe place she thought was beyond his reach. He won't give up, she whispered. Even if you convince him I'm not here, he'll be back. He'll keep looking until what? Malachi was checking his rifle with practiced skill, muscle memory from his years as sheriff taking over. Until he finds you, drags you, back to marry him, whether you want to or not. Yes. The simple honesty of it seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He stopped what he was doing and really looked at her. This woman who'd stumbled into his carefully ordered world and turned it upside down in a matter of hours. Well then, he said, moving toward the door with grim determination. I guess we better make sure that doesn't happen. The knock when it came was polite, almost friendly. The kind of knock that said, we know you're in there, and we're willing to be civilized about this for now. Malachi Thorne. Clayton's voice carried easily through the wooden door. Apologies for the late hour. I'm looking for someone who might have passed this way. A young woman in a wedding dress. She's unwell. Needs medical attention. Malachi's hand tightened on his rifle. Behind him, Evangeline pressed herself against the wall, every instinct screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The storm had trapped her here, as surely as if she were in a cage. I'm going to open this door, Malachi said quietly, not taking his eyes off the entrance. When I do, whatever happens next, don't come out of hiding. Promise me. Malachi, I can't let you. Promise me. The desperation in his voice, the way he said her name like it mattered, like she mattered, broke something inside her chest. I promise. He moved toward the door, and Evangeline realized that in the space of a few hours, this stranger had become the only thing standing between her and a fate worse than death, and she was about to watch him risk everything for a woman he barely knew. Malachi opened the door just wide enough to step outside, rifle held casually but ready. The storm had lessened to a steady downpour, but the wind still howled through the mountains like something alive and angry. Clayton Voss sat on his horse like he owned the world, which in many ways he did. Tall, well-dressed even in the rain, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him, 4 men waited in their saddles, arms resting near their weapons with the patience of professional killers. Mr. Thorne. Clayton touched the brim of his hat in mock politeness. Beautiful evening for a ride, wouldn't you say? Little wet for my taste. Malachi kept his voice level, neutral. What can I do for you, Voss? As I mentioned, I'm looking for my bride. Evangeline ran away from our wedding today. Understandable, really. Nerves, cold feet, the usual feminine hysteria. But she's been out in this storm for hours now, and I'm concerned for her health. The way he said bride made Malachi's skin crawl, like she was property that had wandered off and needed to be collected. Haven't seen any women around here. Haven't seen anybody around here for that matter. Clayton's smile widened. Of course not. But you won't mind if my men take a look around. For her safety, you understand. It wasn't a request. One of the riders, a scarred man with dead eyes, was already getting off his horse. Malachi recognized the type. The kind of man who enjoyed hurting things weaker than himself. Actually, I do mind. Malachi shifted slightly, bringing the rifle into a more obvious position. This is private property. You want to search it? You better have a warrant. Warrant? Clayton laughed, the sound cutting through the rain like breaking glass. My dear fellow, I think you're confused about how things work out here. I own the bank that holds the mortgage on half this valley. I control the water rights to most of the streams. Men like you? Well, let's just say you exist at my pleasure. The scarred man had reached the porch now, water dripping from his coat onto Malachi's wooden steps. "Boss says check the house, so I'm checking the house." "No," Malachi said quietly. "You're not." The world seemed to pause. Even the storm held its breath as 5 dangerous men realized that the hermit they'd expected to intimidate wasn't going to back down. Clayton's pleasant expression never changed, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something cold and calculating that made it clear why he'd become one of the most feared men in the territory. "Mr. Thorne, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. My bride is mentally unstable, dangerous even. She attacked me earlier today. You can see the scratches on my face if you look closely. If she's here, she's a threat to your safety." Malachi can indeed see the scratches. He can also see what they really were. Defensive wounds from someone fighting for their life. "She's not here," he said again. "Then you won't mind proving it." The scarred man took another step forward, and Malachi made a decision that would change everything. He raised the rifle, not quite pointing it at anyone, but making his intentions crystal clear. "I said no. If you were Malachi, what would you do? Let them search and hope they don't find Evangeline, or stand your ground and risk a gunfight against 5 armed men? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose, because what Malachi decided next would determine whether either of them lived to see morning. The silence stretched like it was about to snap. 5 men with guns, 1 hermit with a rifle, and somewhere behind the walls, a woman whose life hung in the balance. Clayton studied Malachi with the kind of attention a snake gives a mouse before deciding whether it's worth the effort to strike. The rain continued to fall, but the storm's violence had moved on, leaving behind an almost unnatural quiet. "You know," Clayton said like he was having a normal conversation, settling back in his saddle. "I've heard stories about you, Malachi Thorne. You used to be sheriff down in Copper Creek, didn't you? Before you decided to play hermit up here in the mountains." Malachi's grip tightened on his rifle. His past wasn't something he talked about, especially not with men like Clayton Voss. "Heard you were quite the lawman. Fair, honest, the kind of man who believed in justice." Clayton's smile turned sharp. "Also heard about why you left. Something about a wife who preferred the company of other men." The words hit like a physical blow. Malachi felt 10 years of carefully buried pain surge to the surface, threatening to consume the iron control he'd built around his emotions. Behind him, through the thin cabin walls, he could feel Evangeline listening, and that awareness kept him steady. "Ancient history," he said. "Is it? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're making the same mistake again, risking everything for a woman who will eventually show you her true nature." Clayton leaned forward in his saddle. "Evangeline is beautiful, I'll give you that. But she's also a liar, a thief, and thoroughly unstable. The scratches on my face?" That was her reaction to a gentle conversation about our future together. Malachi had seen enough victims in his time as sheriff to recognize the truth. The scratches on Clayton's face weren't from someone who was unstable. They were from someone fighting for their life. "Like I said, she's not here." Clayton sighed, the sound of a patient man reaching the end of his tolerance. "James." The scarred man stepped forward eagerly, hand moving to his gun. But before he could draw, Malachi did something unexpected. He laughed. It was a harsh sound, rusty from not being used, but it cut through the tension like a blade. All 5 men went still, suddenly uncertain. "You want to know what's funny?" Malachi said, pointing his rifle at Clayton's chest. 10 years ago, when my wife betrayed me, I thought my life was over. Thought I'd never trust anyone again. Never care about anything except surviving from one day to the next." The rifle didn't waver. His voice grew quieter, more dangerous. "But you know what I learned up here in these mountains? Sometimes the things we think will destroy us actually teach us what we're really made of. And right now, looking at you, and your hired killers threatening an innocent woman, I'm remembering exactly why I became a lawman in the first place." Clayton's composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Thorne, you're making a very serious mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." Malachi's finger moved to the trigger. "And if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." The standoff could have lasted seconds or hours. In the end, it was broken by the sound of a horse approaching from the direction of town. A single rider moving fast despite the muddy conditions. All heads turned as a young man on horseback came into view, wearing a deputy's badge and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Voss," the deputy called out, pulling his horse to a stop at the edge of the clearing. "Sheriff sent me to find you. Says there's been a development in the Blackwood mine situation. Needs you back in town immediately." Clayton's jaw tightened with frustration, but Malachi could see him thinking about odds and consequences. Whatever was happening with the mine was apparently more important than continuing this fight. "This isn't over, Thorne," Clayton said, gathering his reins. "Evangeline belongs to me, and I always collect what's mine." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Malachi replied. "And if you come back here, you better bring more men." Clayton wheeled his horse around, motioning for his men to follow. As they rode away into the darkness, the deputy lingered for a moment. "You might want to consider leaving the territory, Mr. Thorne," he said quietly. Clayton Voss doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. As the last hoofbeats faded into the distance, Malachi remained on his porch, rifle still ready, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. Only when he was certain they were truly gone did he allow himself to breathe again. But he knew the deputy was right. Clayton would be back. And next time, he'd come prepared for war. Malachi stood in the doorway for several minutes after the riders disappeared, letting the rain wash over him as he thought about what had just happened. For 10 years, he'd avoided exactly this kind of fight, this kind of complication. Now he'd just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the territory, and all for a woman he'd known for less than a day. When he finally stepped back inside, Evangeline was sitting on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket, but no longer hiding. Her face was pale, but her green eyes held something he hadn't expected to see. Not gratitude, not relief, but guilt. "You should have let him take me," she said quietly. "Like hell. Malachi, you don't understand what you've done." Clayton doesn't. "Just forget. He'll come back with more men and I know exactly what I've done." He set the rifle aside and moved to the fireplace, adding another log to keep the flames high. "And I know exactly who Clayton Voss is." Evangeline studied his face in the firelight, seeing something there that made her stomach clench. "There's history between you two. Not directly, but I've cleaned up enough of his messes to know what kind of man he is." Malachi's voice carried the weight of old memories, old failures. 3 years ago, when I was still wearing a badge, a young woman came to me. Said Clayton was forcing her to marry him to cover her father's debts. I told her to trust the law, that I'd find a way to help her. The silence that followed told Evangeline everything she needed to know about how that story ended. What happened to her? Found her body in the river a week later. Officially ruled a suicide, but everyone knew the truth. His hands clenched into fists. I had the evidence to prove Clayton was involved, but somehow it all disappeared from the sheriff's office, along with the witness testimonies. And the sheriff got himself a nice new house and suddenly decided he didn't want to pursue the case any further. Evangeline felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd known Clayton was dangerous, had seen glimpses of the violence he was capable of, but hearing it confirmed made her realize just how close she'd come to disappearing forever. "Why didn't you fight it? You were the law." Malachi turned to look at her, and she saw something in his eyes that broke her heart. The look of a man who'd lost faith in everything he'd once believed in. "Because I learned that justice isn't about what's right. It's about who has the most money and the most guns. Clayton had both, so you ran away. I survived." The word came out harsher than he'd intended. "Same thing you're trying to do." Evangeline pulled the blanket tighter around herself, suddenly understanding why this isolated ranch felt so much like a prison. Malachi hadn't just been hiding from the world. He'd been hiding from his own failure to protect someone who trusted him. "The woman who died," she said carefully. "What was her name?" "Sarah Mitchell." His voice grew quiet. "She was 19 years old. had her whole life ahead of her. And you've been carrying that guilt for 3 years. Some things you don't get to put down. Evangeline stood up, moving closer to the fire, closer to him. Clayton told me I was lucky to be marrying him. Said most women in my situation didn't get such a generous offer. Most women in your situation end up dead. The brutal honesty of it hit her like a slap. She'd known she was in danger, but hearing someone else say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. So what do? He'll be back. And when he comes, he'll bring enough men to burn this place to the ground if he has to. Malachi was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might hold answers to questions he'd been asking himself for years. We have maybe 12 hours before he sorts out whatever crisis pulled him away, he said, finally. After that, ... After that, we run. No, his voice was firm, final. I'm done running. The way he said it made Evangeline's heart race with something that might have been hope or might have been terror. But before she could ask what he meant, they heard something that made both of them freeze. Footsteps on the porch. Malachi grabbed his rifle in one fluid motion, motioning for Evangeline to get behind the couch. But instead of the harsh knock they'd heard before, this sound was different. Tentative, almost apologetic. Mr. Thorne, a young voice called through the door. It's Deputy Morrison. I'm alone. Malachi approached the door cautiously, rifle ready. Through the window, he could see the same young deputy who'd interrupted the standoff earlier, standing by himself in the rain. What do you want, Morrison? To help, sir, if you'll let me. Malachi exchanged a glance with Evangeline. This could be a trap, or it could be the first stroke of luck they'd had all night. You're Clayton's man now, Malachi said through the door. No, sir. I'm the law's man. At least I'm trying to be. Something in the deputy's voice, a mixture of fear and determination, reminded Malachi of himself 20 years ago, when he first pinned on a badge and believed he could make a difference. Against his better judgment, he opened the door. Deputy Morrison was younger than Malachi had thought, maybe 25, with the kind of earnest face that hadn't yet learned to hide disappointment. He stepped inside, hat in hand, water dripping from his coat. Deputy, Malachi said carefully, speak your piece. Morrison glanced at Evangeline, who was watching him with wary eyes from behind the couch. Ma'am, I want you to know that what happened today at the church, not everyone thinks it was right. What happened at the church? Malachi asked. Morrison looked uncomfortable. Miss Evangeline's brother, Tommy, tried to stop the wedding. Said his sister was being forced into it. Against her will. Clayton had him beaten unconscious and thrown in jail on charges of disturbing the peace. Evangeline gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Is Tommy alive? Yes, ma'am, but he's hurt bad. Clayton's keeping him locked up until after. Until after the situation is resolved. So that was Clayton's insurance policy. Even if Evangeline escaped, he still had leverage to bring her back. Why are you telling us this? Malachi demanded. Morrison straightened his shoulders, looking every inch the lawman he was trying to become. Because I became a deputy to protect people, not to help rich men collect their property. And because I know what happened to Sarah Mitchell. The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Malachi's expression hardened. What do you know about Sarah? I know she didn't kill herself. I know Clayton had her murdered when she refused to marry him. Morrison's voice shook slightly. And I know Sheriff Bradley destroyed the evidence to protect him. You can't prove any of that. Maybe not in court, but I was there when they pulled her body from the river. I saw the marks on her throat, the bruises on her wrists. That wasn't suicide, Mr. Thorne. That was murder. Malachi felt something shift inside his chest. A door he'd kept locked for 3 years, creaking open. Why didn't you speak up then? I was green, scared. Figured the sheriff knew what he was doing. Morrison's hands clenched into fists. I've regretted that silence every day since. Evangeline stood up, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. You said you wanted to help. How? Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out a badge. A federal marshal star that gleamed even in the dim firelight. Marshal Williams is on his way from the territorial capital. Should be here by morning. He's been investigating Clayton's operations for months, waiting for the right moment to move. Morrison looked directly at Evangeline. Your testimony about the forced marriage, combined with what happened to Sarah, might be enough to finally bring him down. Might be. Malachi's voice was skeptical. It's a chance. More than we've had before. Evangeline looked between the two men, seeing hope in their faces, but feeling only the weight of impossible choices. You don't understand, she said quietly. Clayton doesn't just threaten me. He has my brother. If I testify against him, Tommy's dead. Either way, Morrison said bluntly, Clayton can't afford to leave witnesses. But if we can get Marshall Williams enough evidence to arrest him, we can save both of you. And if we can't, the deputy's silence was answer enough. Malachi moved to the window, staring out at the darkness where Clayton and his men had disappeared. Somewhere out there, a young man was sitting in a jail cell, beaten and broken because he tried to save his sister. And somewhere else, a killer was planning his next move, confident that money and violence would get him everything he wanted. Just like 3 years ago when Sarah, Mitchell had trusted the law to protect her. The difference was this time, Malachi wasn't going to let the system fail. Morrison, he said, turning back to the deputy. How long until dawn? Maybe 4 hours. And how long until Clayton realizes you're missing? The young man's face went pale. Probably about the same. Evangeline felt her heart sink. Even if the marshal arrived, even if they had enough evidence, Clayton would never let them live long enough to testify. But as she looked at Malike's face in the firelight, she saw something that made her pulse quicken. He was done running, and he was done letting Clayton Voss destroy innocent lives. The question was whether they could survive what came. Next, dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, painting the sky the color of old steel. Malachi stood at his window, watching the sun struggle through the clouds. When he saw them coming, this time, Clayton hadn't brought just 4 men, a dozen. Riders approached through the morning mist, spread out in a wide formation that spoke of military precision. They meant to finish this one way or another. They're here, he said quietly. Evangeline joined him at the window, her face pale but determined. She'd changed into the spare clothes he'd given her, simple pants and a shirt that had once belonged to his wife. Somehow she looked stronger in them, less like a victim and more like a woman ready to fight for her life. Where's Morrison? She asked, circling around to the back ridge. If this goes bad, he'll try to get word to the marshal. And if it goes well? Malachi checked his rifle one last time. Then, we trust that justice still means something in this territory. The riders stopped at the edge of his property, and Clayton, dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight he couldn't buy his way out of. This time, though, he wasn't smiling. Thorne, he called out. We need to talk. Malachi stepped onto his porch, Evangeline beside him. He could feel her trembling, but she didn't back down. I'm listening, Malachi replied. Simple trade. The woman, for her brother. You hand her over. Tommy goes free. And you get to keep your peaceful little life up here. And if I refuse? Clayton spread his arms wide, gesturing to the armed men surrounding the cabin. Then we burn it all down and sort through. The ashes for what's left of you. It was then that Evangeline did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward. I'll come with you, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Evangeline, no, Malachi started. But I have conditions, she continued, ignoring him. Tommy goes free, unharmed, and you leave Malachi alone forever. Clayton's smile returned. You're hardly in a position to negotiate, my dear, aren't I? Evangeline's voice grew stronger. You've already proven you'll kill anyone who gets in your way. Sarah Mitchell proved that. But if you harm either of them, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you really are. Even if it's the last thing I do. The mention of Sarah's name made Clayton's face darken. Careful, Evangeline. You're walking on dangerous ground. We're all walking on dangerous ground. She took another step forward. The difference is, I'm done being afraid of you. That's when they heard it. The thunder of approaching horses from the opposite direction. But these riders carried something. The others didn't. Federal badges that gleamed in the morning sun. Marshal Williams arrived with 6 men, all armed and all wearing the grim expressions of lawmen who'd seen too much corruption go unpunished. Clayton's confidence faltered for the first time as he realized his careful plans were about to unravel. "Clayton Voss," the marshal called out, dismounting with practiced efficiency. "You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Mitchell, conspiracy to commit murder, and human trafficking." "You have no proof," Clayton snarled, but his hand was already moving toward his gun. "We have Deputy Morrison's testimony, Miss Evangeline's statement about the forced marriage, and a federal investigation that's been building a case against you for months." The marshal's voice was calm, final. "It's over." The gunfight that followed was brief but brutal. Clayton drew first, but Morrison's shot from the ridge was faster. When the smoke cleared, Clayton Voss lay D.